introduction and for the invitation to be here today. I've been living in Galway while on sabbatical from Penn State since December 31st. And so although today I came from Galway, I think I probably win the prize for the longest distance to get here today. So as was mentioned earlier, family literacy and adult education programs are under increasing pressure to document effectiveness. In the United States, this tends to follow a very narrow definition, primarily standardized test scores and job placement rates, among other factors. And my understanding, which was confirmed this morning, is that Ireland is very much following in these footsteps, especially with an emphasis on employment, workplace skills, and so forth. So within this context, my argument this morning is that action research is a powerful way for you to document what is happening in your programs, to document learner outcomes and monitor them, and also use that to improve your programs. What action research does is that it puts more control over the research process into the hands of teachers, practitioners, and administrators who know your programs best. So it puts things more on your terms and your footing. So today I'll give a brief overview of what action research is, reasons that you might want to use it, and how it works in practice with a couple of examples from Pennsylvania. And then you'll also have a chance to think about how you might apply action research in your own settings. And I want to acknowledge here that I'm borrowing extensively from the work of Alan Quigley in Canada and my colleague Drusy Wyrock at the Goodling Institute, who works extensively with family literacy programs in Pennsylvania around action research. And their work is listed in the references. So what is action research? One of the quotes from the Action Research Handbook that my colleague Drusy developed says that it is a reflective process of progressive problem solving that helps you to answer questions you have about issues in your program or practice. In a community of learners, practitioners decide their own questions and work collaboratively to find ways to improve their practice and programs. So it's collaborative, it's focused on a specific issue or problem that you identify, and it leads to improved practice. In addition, Quigley writes that in action research, we systematically analyze a problem, review the literature and relevant experience, set a baseline for purposes of comparative analysis, systematically gather evidence on observed changes, and collectively reflect on the outcomes. One of the important things to note here is that doing research is not just for professors like me who do this, for a living. If you think about research as poking and prying with a purpose, this really opens it up to a much wider range of people who don't, have to have specialized training. And so today gives you, broad outlines of how you would go about doing research. So you should think of yourselves as having, every right and capability to be involved in this type of research. All right, so reasons for using action research. There are two broad sets of reasons, and this also follows along with participatory approaches to research, community development, educational planning, and so forth. The first set of reasons is ethical. So essentially, as educators and participants, you have a right and capacity to build knowledge about your own programs. So certainly, requirements for evidence can often be imposed on you from the outside, but you have the right and the ability to build your own knowledge as well. So one of Quigley's quotes about this says that practitioners and learners can begin to voice their own realities through action research. They can begin to create and own their own knowledge for practical change, and they can begin to build momentum for public and policy change with supportive data. And the key here for me is beginning to voice your own realities. So again, putting you more in the driver's seat. The second set of reasons is more pragmatic or practical. First of all, there are a lot of benefits for educators, including honing your skills in problem posing and problem solving, deepening your knowledge about your own program and instructional practices, enrollment practices, every dimension of your programmatic practices. It's also a way to improve program effectiveness, to gather evidence to document program outcomes, which is the primary focus of your being here today. And finally, it can stimulate change on many different scales, all the way from the individual to the institution. Quigley writes, it has the potential to influence, if not transform, the researcher, the research participants, their collective work or activities, the setting they're a part of, and the culture they share. So at many different scales, it has great potential. How does it work? And here I'll just give a very brief overview before going into details. So ideally, it's practiced in a group of critical friends, not just by yourself in isolation, but with colleagues in your program or across programs where you can share advice, make plans together, share your collective wisdom and knowledge. It's essentially an iterative, cyclical cycle of problem posing and problem solving. And it's captured by this graphic here of problem posing, planning, observing, reflecting, and then going back to problem posing. So it's built on the premise that, as Kurt Lewin said in the 1940s, the best way to understand something is to try to change it. So action research isn't just about documenting what's happening, it's also changing what's happening in a way that you want it to change, not unintended changes. So I'll just give a brief example of action research in practice, and I'm not going to go into all the details here because you have it in your handout and can consult more of the details later. So this is part of what's called the SEQUEL project, or Statewide Educational Quality for Family Literacy in Pennsylvania. These projects occurred between 2007 and 2011, when unfortunately they ran out of funding to continue this further. So participating programs could choose among 3 predetermined topics. This was for this last round. Or they could identify their own topic. So there were some parameters given to them. So the program that I'm going to highlight, and I've kept their name confidential just for privacy purposes, had this question focusing their action research project. And I'll just explain. The ASIRI is the Adult Child Interactive Reading Inventory, which is a useful tool if you're not aware of it. So their guiding question was, to what extent can we increase the quality of parent-child interaction as measured by the ASIRI tool through teaching basic literacy skills, increased focus on quality parenting education, implementation of the core messages, as well as the incorporation of the behaviors on the ASIRI tool. And that's a long question, but I'm going to break it down for you here. So they have several planned outcomes. They have their interventions that will help them achieve those outcomes. They have data sources that they're going to use to see whether they reached those goals. And then they have their results of what happened from their intervention and data collection. So their first planned outcome was raising test scores for parents and children on this phonological awareness literacy screening. They had a couple of interventions or actions that they thought would help them achieve that goal. Their data source for this was the PALS scores for adults and children, and then you see the results there. So their second outcome or goal was to improve the quality of the time that parents spend with their children in a variety of settings. So again, you see a couple of different interventions that they selected to achieve that. They have the ASIRI test as a data source and also parent journals. So we're seeing multiple types of data, not just one measure. And their last goal that was focused on families was to enhance the effectiveness of ILAs. I'm not sure if that acronym is used here in Ireland. In the States, it stands for Interactive Literacy Activities. So that's whenever parents and kids are interacting together around books, literacy, writing, etc. So again, they have several different interventions to achieve that. Here, for their data sources, they have the ASIRI test. They have parent surveys and activities from a curriculum that they implemented. They have their interactive literacy activity portfolio documenting what the parents did, and an observation checklist that was completed by the educators. So multiple forms of evidence, so they're not just gathering one type. And you can read in your handout their reflections on what they gained from this whole process, which essentially they did see improvements in the parents, and it also helped the program just improve the quality of what they were doing around the interactive literacy activities. So this just gives you a little bit of taste of how they structured this action research project in their program. Very specific focus and very clear results that they obtained. So to go into more about the phases of the action research cycle, the first phase is problem posing. Another way of thinking about this is question posing. This is where you are figuring out what's the problem, issue, or concern that you want to focus on. In other words, what is broken or not working as well as you would hope? Or where do you want to see improvement? So I want to emphasize it's really crucial to understand what the problem is before you jump to the solutions. I think it's very just a human tendency to want to say, oh, this will fix the problem, without really stepping back and peeling back the layers to find out what's the source of the issue or problem. So once you have a good understanding of that, then you can really decide what some possible solutions might be. And you also need to decide which aspect of the problem you can realistically address. Things that are way outside of your control are not something that you want to address in an action research project because you're probably not going to see results and it will just be very frustrating. So next you want to identify your intervention. In other words, what will you do to improve or change the problem? And this would be that second column in the example I gave you from that program. Which actions would be most likely to produce the desired outcomes? And considerations that you need are, first of all, feasibility. Do you have the resources, the people, the time, et cetera, to be able to carry this out? And second, what reasons justify your belief that this intervention will be beneficial? Is that based on your personal observations? Is it based on research literature? Is it based on collective wisdom of having been in the field for a number of years? So you're not just stabbing in the dark and guessing at what might improve the situation. You're taking educated guesses or working on your best hunches of what would be helpful. So in the second phase, you go into planning. And this is where there are a number of elements. First of all, your timeline, when to stop and start your project, when you'll collect all of your data and analyze it. Informed consent of all of these stakeholders, and I would really encourage you to try and get participants as involved as possible also in these projects, in determining what the questions are, what measures might be used. Perhaps they can even be involved in collecting and analyzing data themselves. Which really gives them more control over the process. Institutional approval, so what kind of administrative permission or approval is needed? What kinds of resources will you need to be able to carry out the project successfully? And then lastly, and this is very important, your data collection techniques. So ideally, you should use more than one type of data, and the reason for this is what researchers call triangulation, which means that when you have two or more pieces of evidence that are telling you a similar thing, it gives you more confidence in the results. Or they might tell you different things, which can also be very useful for trying to figure out why, which one might be more accurate, or whether there are different sides of the story. They can be qualitative and or quantitative, and I've just listed a few examples here. There are many more, but these are some of the most obvious ones that you might use. Survey questions, standardized measures like the PALS test that I mentioned earlier, or others that have been developed by psychologists or educational psychologists. Interviews, focus groups, observational notes, video analysis, photographic analysis, document analysis. And some of those latter ones, like video analysis, could also be used for counting. How often do parents ask their children open-ended questions while reading, as opposed to closed-ended? So you'll need to, again, choose carefully which one of those you think will provide you with the best evidence. You'll need to identify your criteria for success. So how will you know if your intervention worked? What are your measures? How will you know if you've succeeded? For example, let's say you're focusing on retention. Did retention improve 20% compared to the previous year? Or 10% or 40%? And again, with good reasons for selecting your benchmark. So another way of putting this is, what were the initial patterns of behavior, knowledge, or attitudes, and how have they changed? And what's different and compared to what? So one important thing about surveys, if you decide to use those, I strongly recommend using pre-post surveys as opposed to retrospective. So in a retrospective survey, you ask someone a question at the end of your program or intervention. For example, I read to my child more often than I did before starting classes. Yes, no, or strongly agree to strongly disagree. What happens with this is I can barely remember what I did yesterday, let alone 10 weeks ago. So there's a recall problem. There's also what's called social desirability bias. People want to please you and the program, so they're going to be very likely to say, oh yes, I definitely read more often. So it overestimates the amount of change. So it's much better to ask a pre-post where you ask them the same question at the beginning and at the end. For example, how often do you read to your child each week? And then simply compare whether the averages increased, decreased, or stayed the same. You'll need to, in the planning phase, also craft a researchable question. And what I mean by that is something that's focus specific and measurable. And it should include the problem area, your goal, and your intervention. So a very broad question that I wouldn't recommend is, how can we increase enrollment? A more focused one is, will distance learning increase enrollment by 20%? Similarly, a broad one would be, how can we improve adult education gains? A better question is, to what extent will the use of authentic materials increase the frequency of parents reading and writing outside the classroom? So the ones on the right-hand column are much more focused. They're questions that you can actually answer with data. So then you go into your observing, and this is where you're actually collecting your data. So you need to do this systematically, also analyzing the data once you've collected it. Detailed record keeping, so that you can keep track of everything that you're collecting and write up a detailed report. And also careful selection of the sample. So how will you decide which participants, which classrooms, which programs, which teachers? And I think I included this in the references, a chapter by Michael Quinn Patton on sampling, which I would highly recommend as a really useful way to think about how to know which people or programs or classrooms to select. So finally, after you've collected and analyzed all of your data, you'll need to figure out, what does this mean? What happened? What were the results? What do you take away from it? And specifically, how do these results compare to your benchmarks? So let's go back to the increasing retention by 20%. Did you meet that goal or not? If not, why not? What do you think went wrong? What went right? So if the intervention was effective, you'll need to decide, should you do another cycle? Are there further improvements or other things you could try again? If you get the same results, this really helps build the trustworthiness and credibility of your findings, because it suggests that it wasn't just random, it wasn't just this particular group of students or classroom, that you were on the right track in terms of your intervention and you're starting to see the same kinds of results. If your intervention wasn't effective, then you'll need to decide, should you change something about it? Should you try a completely new one or pursue a different problem? And also, which aspects of the intervention will you keep? So are you going to institutionalize the new things that you tried, or just take bits and pieces of what you think were most effective? And also, to build knowledge in the field, how can you share your results? Not just within your program, but across your program, in venues like this, or even internationally. And that's really how you as educators, administrators, practitioners can be involved in helping to create a bigger, stronger knowledge base within family learning. So first of all, before we go into an activity, do you have any questions about the basics of what's involved in action research? And I realize this is a very quick overview, but in terms of just the essential components. Oh, okay. Okay, well, feel free to ask during or after the activity. So what we're going to do, let me just put all of these out here, is I'm going to ask in a second for us to identify a problem area that all of you will focus on for this activity. Then what you'll do is in pairs or groups of 3, whatever your preference is, you'll work with the last sheet in your handout packet, which is a table with 3 columns. And so what I'd like each of you to do with your pair or trio is to identify one planned outcome. So think about completing this sentence. Participants will. They will read more often to their children. They will, or the program will. The program will increase attendance. The participants will be able to transfer workplace skills into their job, etc. Then what's one intervention that you could try that would increase the likelihood of achieving that outcome? What do you think will help participants be able to achieve that goal? And then what evidence would you use to know whether you achieved that goal? Is there a standardized test? Would you do a survey? Would you do observations, parent journals? So using some of the examples that I gave earlier or any others that you can think of. So in terms of documenting evidence in family literacy or challenges that your programs are facing, that going back to that first question of problem posing, what is a common problem, challenge, issue, or concern that you are facing in your family learning programs that we could focus on for the purpose of this activity?
One of the issues that we have come across is to actually get parents to engage in the program, to get them to participate and to attend on a regular basis.
Okay, so
that's one of the key things that are really difficult. They may come the first week, and then it's very sporadic, or sometimes they won't come at all.
Okay, so regular attendance, especially after the first week. So there's a persistence problem. Okay, are there other suggestions, or is that something that everyone would like to focus on for the activity?
Getting the target would be either school leave or parents.
Okay.
Just try and target them to get them in.
So that's a targeted recruitment problem. Okay. So, I mean, I'll revise this. We don't all have to focus on the same problem. If let's set those 2 areas, and if you have something else you want to focus on, that's perfectly fine. Just write it at the top of your paper to keep track. So the 2 proposed areas, and you can choose one, the other, or your own, is this targeted recruitment of how to attract the early school leavers into your programs, and then also the persistence issue of increasing the number and percentage of participants that continue after the first week. So working with either of those problems or another one that you identify, think about what your planned outcome is. What do you want to see happen? What intervention or interventions could you try to help achieve that? And then what evidence would you use to know whether you were successful? So we have until 11? Okay, so why don't you take 10 minutes, and then we'll leave 10 minutes to report back and discuss. I know this is very quick, but just as an exercise. Feel free to ask questions if you have any. Raise your hands. I realize that many of you may not be finished yet, but just for the sake of time, let's wrap up your conversations. Looked like people were busy at work. So I'd just like to ask for a couple of examples from your groups, and I'll type them in here so we can see the variety of outcomes, interventions, and data sources that you are considering. So I'll just ask for a volunteer to share what you filled in on your chart. Yep.
Okay, Katie and I looked at the problem of persistence because whoever mentioned it was exactly what we were thinking, is that attendance, that people come to family learning all enthusiastic and then they don't last if the attendance good enough. And perhaps I'd cribbing a little bit here because Yvonne had sent around an article on the whole issue of persistence, and then there were 5 factors identified that would help to achieve persistence. I couldn't remember only 1 or 2 of them, but one of them that did stick out in my mind was better information at the beginning of the course to contextualize the course for the learners. And sometimes learners will come in thinking they're signing up for a particular course, and then it turns out that's not the kind of course that they wanted. If we don't find out at the very beginning that there's that mismatch, then they're likely to disappear.
Okay.
And you don't see them again. So we got that far, and we agreed that that was a good thing to do, and and to have a discussion thing.
Okay.
But what we're not clear on is what kind of data sources do we get?
Okay. So what
that you actually did that, or that it was effective?
Can you go back? What was your planned outcome?
So the planned outcome was to improve the attendance.
Okay.
Digital stories or stained glass course or anything that attendance frequently starts off with a big number and then we lose.
Right.
So we were looking at possibly question, is it that learners don't have enough information and they're actually signing up for a course thinking they're going for one thing, or did they come in, they don't get what I would think is a picture of what the course is like, a picture, a vision for them, and so engaging becomes threatening to them because they don't see. So by spending a nice bit of time at the beginning in the first session creating that picture and making it clear what's going on, our learners likely to come back, and in particular, if it's not meeting their needs, to be able to address that and say, we can adjust the course, or there's another one running down the hall there that I think is more what you're looking for. So that better information, a clearer picture at the beginning would be the intervention. But how then do you actually measure that? We didn't get that far.
Okay, so just to go backwards here. So the intervention or action is essentially your theory about what you think will improve the situation. So in this case, your planned outcome is pretty straightforward. It's attendance. So one of your data sources would have to be attendance records. So, and you would need to identify, your benchmark. What percentage do you want to see attendance increase by? Or actually, in this case, it would be the persistence. You would need to decide. We want to retain 75% of learners beyond the second week of class, etc. So then you would just need to collect data showing what percentage of learners actually did that, and comparing it, you would need to decide, do you compare that to last year, to the last 2 years, how many, what's your time unit that you're using. So for attendance, you would just need some sort of attendance record as your main data source. So I'll just type that in there. Okay, so let's hear another example. I saw the hand in the back go up first. Oh, yes.
How can you attribute, though, if there is an improvement, how can you attribute it to better information rather than anything else?
That is a very good question. You would probably need to, in the research world, run a randomized controlled trial to make sure that it's about that and not anything else. So that's another reason why you want to do several cycles. If you do this same thing again with a different class and you don't get the same results, then there may be something else going on. So, the more you do this with the more people and the more situations, the more confidence you can have that it was about your intervention and not other random things. So yeah, great question. Yes?
Do you have an additional data source, like a survey?
What
you thought?
the survey might help you understand why parents stayed or didn't stay. So that could, for example, you could have a survey on how useful they found, that information at the beginning of the course. So the survey wouldn't necessarily tell you how many of them persisted, but it would give you their feedback on the, action or intervention that you tried. Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say in response to that, Margaret, that maybe if you did it across all courses for 2000 and, starting in September, say, and then you'd have a base to compare with previous courses in 2013 and 2012. You'd have it right across, so it wouldn't be just one tutor. Wouldn't be dependent on one tutor. You'd get a much, wider picture. I think that would probably stand up in terms of research.
And if it's also, if it's something where you could try it in a couple of classrooms and not try it in a couple of others with very similar populations of learners. Now, if this is something that would be beneficial for people, like, oh, you're going to give everyone €50 for attending the course, but not the people in that class, well, that brings up all sorts of ethical problems, so you don't want to do that. So it needs, if you, go that route of the, control group and the group that you're trying the intervention with, you need to make sure it's not a benefit that you're depriving people of. One more example, maybe? Yes.
I suppose one thing was working on time management. Something else was maybe seeing why people were coming late or leaving early, whether they were working or they had to meet a social welfare officer, or whether they had a medical appointment, or maybe just talking to other organisations or groups that were working with the learners.
Okay. Great, and so what were your data sources?
Yeah, that was the difficult part to measure. I mean, if you look at attendance records, you can see that people have been attending, but it doesn't say that they, only get half the actual time. So that's the part that is difficult to
right. So
to
just
measure.
Thinking out loud here, what are some ways that you would be able to document how many people and how often they arrived late or left early?
I mean,
Okay, science sheet.
yeah.
Maybe there's a way to get participants, themselves involved in, some sort of time journaling. That could even, be used for math lessons or, graphing, etc. So yeah, with a lot of these, you can just think creatively about, okay, how would you know that this improved? Sign-in sheets, time-use diary, etc. But yeah, that, the issue of getting to the bottom of it, why are people coming late or leaving early? I think that can be very eye-opening. In the rural United States, transportation issues are just horrible, and just the amount of time and energy that it takes for a low-income person to do something basic like, make it to a doctor's appointment is, I think, really, eye-opening for those of us who don't live in those circumstances. So that would be a really important component of your intervention, I think. Well, we're out of time here, so I'm happy to talk with anybody during the breaks, lunch, etc. And I hope that this will be useful for you in your programs.